Hey guys, welcome to Book Review 127. Today I will be reviewing The Teardrop Island, Following Victorian Footsteps Across Sri Lanka by Sherry Briggs. Now, Sherry Briggs is from the United Kingdom, and she moved to Sri Lanka to teach students in a school there. But the vast majority of this book is not about her teaching experience, but is actually about some of the travels she had on the island of Sri Lanka. While following in the footsteps of, gotta get to the right page, Sir James Emerson Tennant, who wrote a book called Ceylon. And he traveled to Sri Lanka in 1845 and I think lived there 7 or 8 years or something like that. But she kind of follows in his footsteps and kind of compares and contrasts some of what was going on with Sri Lanka then versus Sri Lanka now. It really covers a lot of sort of the more well-known, I don't want to say necessarily tourist sites, but kind of well-known historical sites that have become tourist sites subsequently within Australia, within Sri Lanka. She obviously covers her time in Colombo, sees a cricket match that takes place between two sort of I guess you would call them the equivalent of like blue blood or hoity-toity schools that are in Colombo, and how the circle of sort of elite prep school, wealthy families within Colombo, they tie cultural shares to the rest of Colombo, but aren't really, it's not the heart of the nation, and they live pretty radically different lives from the majority of people on the rest of the island, as well as the majority of people within Colombo itself, who are by no means wealthy either. She sees Gale, sees some of the wreckage of I believe it was 2004, December 2004. Sumatra tsunami, which spread all across the Indian Ocean and did vast damage to the island of Sri Lanka. She kind of talks about kind of the mixed results of some of the UN efforts that have gone in there, not just UN, but Red Cross, the large sort of, and well, really across the board, charity organizations that have helped people out. And interestingly enough, something that she said in the book was that it was very horrific for people, particularly if you lost a family or just the experience of going through a tsunami itself, this tidal wave of water pretty much inundating your entire village. But ironically, some people call it the golden wave, I believe she said in the book, because there was so many funds that were dumped into the areas that were affected by the tsunami, specifically in the tourist areas. Some of the areas that are more remote along the East Coast, I wouldn't have named this, but in areas where I guess the incentive to get the town rebuilt was prominent or imminent, or prominent, I guess. She said that it was called the Golden Wave because of people often lived in nicer houses than they had before they had the wave had hit. A lot of times their circumstances were, if not up to what we'd consider a high quality of life in the West, were at least somewhat marginally better than the lives that they had been living prior to the tsunami, and certainly before any of the aid organizations had really been able to, put their muscle behind the relief effort. But I just thought that was kind of ironic. She also goes on to visit a number of peaks and old kingdoms. These include Adam's Peak, which I believe she talked kind of about, these steps that go up, and there's the famous footprint of the Buddha that is at the top of the mountain. But of course, if you're a cynical atheist, and I wouldn't consider myself an atheist, but I could certainly see on this point of view why these people would have this cynical opinion. It's probably not the footprint of the Buddha. I would think. I think that it's some natural rock formation, but in the ways that religion often provides meaning in people's lives, independent of, I don't want to call them out on truth, but just sort of independent of, what actually happened. Uh, this has become very meaningful for people, and there's huge pilgrimages every year that visit Adams Peak. She also visits Katy, as well as Katy, I believe, being the old British settlement. Oh, it's the Cadian Kingdom. Okay, so there's really two things that are going on here. There's the Cadian Kingdom, which Sri Lanka was held under the Portuguese and then the Dutch in the 1500s and 1600s respectively. And then more or less for like the last 250 years of its colonization, it was held by the British. But during the early colonization time periods, and really even for a time under the British, the Kingdom of Katy was hostile towards colonization. They were never, or at least until a time period, they weren't able to be colonized because of their fierce fighting, as well as being an inland mountainous kingdom, kind of a sub-kingdom of Sri Lanka, if you will, that had little access and was just much harder to colonize than the coast. So she talks about that. She also talks about kind of the history of tea plantations around Katy, as well as just sort of the British presence as a, what do I want to say, mountain kingdom, as an estate that British people would retreat to, like a summer estate that British would retreat to in the summertime when it was really hot around the coasts. They could get more mild and more temperate temperatures up in this highland area of central Sri Lanka. Same can be said for Prusawana and Nur, I'm sure I'm butchering these, Nuwara Eliya. She again talks about some of the British tea plantations. She mentions that in the first of these two towns, Pusalara, Larwa, how there's sort of a kind of almost a burgeoning gentrification effort, I guess you call it, of old tea plant estates that people can now rent out as hotels. And they still run as tea plantations, Sri Lankan tea still being very valued across the world. But the owners and the people that work the tea plantations will often live in separate quarters from the old mansions that existed, 200, 250 years ago. And that's where, like the guests that want to stay in these very idyllic retreats will go to. Of course, not everything is idyllic. The British kind of press ganged, if not pure slavery, press ganged a lot of these people to pick the tea for them in colonial times and in modern times. Obviously, there's still a lot of impoverishment within the island of Sri Lanka. Enjoying a little drink here. White wine from Spain, from Galicia. Next, she hits up the East Coast, as I mentioned, much less developed. This primarily being because it's not in the pure Buddhist area, and this is what I'm going to start talking about, the divide between the Hindu Tamil Tigers and the Buddhist southern half of the island. Well, the Tamil Tigers is only one group within the Tamils, but the Tamil Tigers being like the most extreme. And then there's another group in the south who are essentially the Buddhists, who are kind of the native peoples, at least they feel they are, to Sri Lanka, whereas the Tamil Tigers, who have much more interaction, and why do I keep saying Tamil Tigers? It's such an easy word to say. The Tamils, the Tamil ethnic group, has much more cultural and religious ties to the mainland of India. They settled the island later, so there's just sort of that conflict between two cultures, even though in the West we often see these two cultures as inherently peaceful. That's actually not the case. She mentions in the book that I believe it was in the like after World War II, maybe, that essentially there was a lot of Buddhism that had died in Sri Lanka. People were still Buddhist, but a lot of them were just nominally Buddhist. And so this more sort of hardline approach against the Tamil Tigers kind of came about, ironically, because Buddhism started gaining a tract in the West, at which point there were a number of almost sort of like reverse missionaries that came to reconvert or refundamentalize almost the Buddhists within Sri Lanka to really revitalize their faith. And to a degree, this is a good thing, in the sense that, you know, it kind of revitalized community. It kind of gave Sri Lankans a separate identity that had long been just seen as inferior to the British, and there wasn't really an identity beyond that. You know, a lot of the history was revived. But with part of that came Buddhist nationalism, which struck up against the Tamil Tigers, or the Tamil, man. And there was a lot of repression, in which case the Tamils largely responded. The Tamils not being completely at fault either. They had largely wanted independence even before this new nationalist movement by the Southern Buddhists. But it kind of came to a head once the groups started really kind of losing all the gray area, and you were either Tamil or Hindu, Tamil, or Buddhist. So yeah, she visits the East Coast. This is the part of the journey where she kind of gets in dicey waters traveling. There's more issues with getting through military checkpoints. She actually, what's interesting, and I actually read this in another book about China, but sometimes they say in the East, if you will, if you want to generalize, that it's easier to it's easier to ask for forgiveness than it is ask for permission. So, she would often kind of be in sort of not necessarily doing anything wrong, but kind of going in areas where maybe she knew she shouldn't be, and then kind of by talking to like mayors or military leaders, not like the very head guys, but guys that had some sway in who can come and go. She was able to travel through much of this area. And also is probably a little bit overblown. Probably not during the Civil War. The Civil War had actually ended. But during the time after that, probably some of the restrictions were overhyped because really most of the conflict had ended. It was just a matter of making sure that it didn't, start back up or whatever. And of course, if it started back up, she'd be up a creek without a paddle. You don't want to be in Jaffna when the cessation of hostilities end. She visits Ener del Perua. That's like an ancient. Well, I'll get back to Ana del Peru in a second. I guess I should talk about Chimcolani. That was sort of it's the one area along the coast that has a natural harbor and was really quite prosperous as a spice trade in the British era. And I think it was actually mentioned by this tenant how successful it was. I guess I haven't really talked about him a lot. He was really... I don't know, she does such a good job at kind of talking about the place itself and integrating his work into it that I'm almost having problems remembering kind of what some of the things that she said was about him. Other than that, he was kind of a very eccentric man and very much loved Sri Lanka and was a civil servant until the end. Okay, so yeah, the city of... Trincomale, Trimacoli, Tricomale. Yeah, she said it's kind of bombed out and just kind of not terrible, but just sort of like in stasis where there doesn't seem like there's really a lot going on. She mentioned that she went up to a famous cliff site in that place. Has a rockhead figure. Um, okay, well then she goes over to Anuradhapura. Now this is an ancient kingdom in the center of the island, similar to Katy, but went out of existence, if you will, or was assumed shortly by the Portuguese and the Dutch. It really didn't stick around long into the colonial era, unlike Haiti, because this place is far enough north that it's really out of the central mountainous region and is kind of in the northern, slightly drier plain area and was easier to take over, thusly. Though really, even though it's on the plain, the capital itself is kind of on a mountain. We've got some sirens in the background. On a mountain that looks like a lion's head, I believe. And there's a long history about some betrayal of a family, of a dynasty that controlled it, and kind of some conniving sons. Yeah, that's really loud. Some conniving sons that I'll take this. You know, and the son eventually got his punishment, but you know, the dad. I don't remember all the details of the story, but it's kind of one of the cornerstone, not really religious, just kind of a cornerstone mythical, historical story from how Sri Lanka was founded. I guess similar to like a George Washington, even though they're in completely separate circumstances. All right, I'm gonna have to come back. All right, you guys, we're gonna try to continue up here. Hopefully there aren't any more sirens in the neighborhood that I'm living in. Well, anyway, next Sherry Briggs goes up to Jaffna, and was sort of the very heartland of Tamil country. Tamil country essentially extends kind of in the northern, maybe like 1/7 of the island, and then through most of kind of a strip along the eastern seaboard. But yeah, Jaffna is kind of on this peninsula and only, you know, like 50 miles or so from the Indian coastline. It has a huge history of trading with India. There's actually some islands within the continent that are like off the Jaffna Peninsula that are very famous as trade points. She actually goes to one of these in the book, but I can't remember what it is. She sees some families there, kind of talks to some local guards, some security. What does she say about Jaffna itself? I think she says that you can kind of see rudimentary business coming back, but it's very much sort of still. She says in the book there was much less military. The people there tell her there's much less military than there was like 2 or 3 years ago. I think this book was written in like 2013 or 14 or something like that. But there's much less military there than there used to be, but there's kind of like, again, this sort of lull that you see where the big businesses aren't necessarily stepping in because they're a little bit worried about what's going on. And in their stead, much like, you know, like when you have a big forest fire and all the trees are burned down, the first shoots that come up are sort of the fast-growing, smaller shoots. And I guess in this metaphor, the equivalent of that would be that she sees a lot of sort of small trade, peddler trade, that kind of thing going on in the city. What else does she say? I remember that island trip quite a bit. You know, she talks to some guards out there and stuff. So that's Jaffna. And there's 2 more places that she went to. She went to Minanyar, which is where the Straits of the Adams Bridge Straits are. And so, like, Jaffna is on a peninsula, but the area between the peninsula and the mainland of India is sort of deep water, even though it has some islands in between. But kind of just geographically, because I'm a geography guy, One of the things that I found interesting about this Adams Bridge Peninsula and kind of the area around it was it's really like a chain of islands that dredge no more than 20 or 30 feet deep, I think. Or not dredge, but are naturally 20 or 30 feet deep, and they have to dredge further in order to get ships through. That runs from the mainland of India to Sri Lanka. And so you obviously can't walk across it, and there's a lot of like smaller islands dotted in between. But obviously you can't walk across it, but it's kind of very much the closest connection to India. Interestingly enough, I don't know why exactly this was. Maybe the influence that the Buddhists were more kind of on the west side, even though they were mostly on the south. The Tamil Tigers extend not really along the Adams Bridge, or at least that's sort of like their southern. So I said Tamil Tigers again. The Tamil Tigers are the fierce guerrilla rebel group that fought against the, the government of Colombo, the Sri Lankan national government. And even really, they're not the Tamil army or the Tamil rebel army. They're the specific, like, I don't know if you call it, whether you want to call them elite forces or terrorists. I think they've been designated as both at various times. But this is the southern area of Tamil area. This area around Mamyar. And she goes there, and she kind of what does she do over there? Well, she sees a lot of stuff around there. Goes out on a peninsula. I think there's some extended talk about Tenant that she has during that time period. But the last place she goes to, and the place that I find really interesting, just because it's the most sort of, or at least she paints it as the most languid, low-key, high-celebrity resort area, is the Calipia Isthmus, which is instead of kind of jutting towards India, kind of just juts along the a little more south along the along the west coast of Sri Lanka, kind of close to Colombo. But she mentions that there's a famous guitar player. I think I almost get the impression that he's like a Jack Johnson type, if you know who Jack Johnson is in the United States. Kind of a very, shoes off, sandals on, beach, low-key strumming the guitar artist that has become very popular in Sri Lanka. And I think India as a whole, but kind of he makes his home in Sri Lanka now. He says that he's from Nepal, but kind of moved to Sri Lanka because, I don't know, for art, for whatever. But she just talks about how they have, in very vivid detail, these, this one late evening she had where they were all drinking, rum and cokes and smoking cigars out on this, almost, I think it was like a hammock almost, but like not like just for one person, but like this spread kind of net that people could lounge around on. Maybe it was just like, those covered beds almost that they have for the outdoors. Along his private property, which he was turning into sort of like a bread and breakfast or a homestay, on this isthmus with the beautiful turquoise blue sea on front and the wide expanse of beach. But she also mentioned the super worried, for a guy that's so has a reputation of being so laid back and casual, the kind of worried attendants that would always run out and help him. I don't think he was really abusive or anything, but I think that they, knew what their job was. So even in paradise, I guess you have people that are your support staff that need to be there to support you. Yeah, she also mentioned that, there was a married man that was a high-end, I believe, commodities trader from Australia. And his wife lived in Australia, but even though he was ethnically Sri Lankan, he was immigrated to Australia when he was a young man and became rich in commodities trading. But he was at this resort as well as with like a movie star or, like a mid-range movie star that was there, a Sri Lankan movie star. and they had these long conversations on the beach, and how the commodities trader actually had his in Sri Lanka only girlfriend having an affair there, which was kind of a little disgusting, but at the same time kind of well, I don't know. She painted definitely a picture of just sort of languid relaxation and enjoyment of the good life, if you will. Yeah, and the kind of the end of the book ends with her going back to Colombo, talking to some of the, the interesting thing about Colombo is it actually has some Tamil residents that uh, live there that kind of immigrated for economic reasons there, and so she kind of talks to this Tamil group, and they're not like super. Not all Tamils are like super militarized or whatever. I mean, that's kind of the reputation they get in the larger media. But it's really only sort of the groups that are fighting for independence that feel that way. There are a lot of Tamils that are just wannabe citizens. It's not necessarily that they don't want to see a Tamil homeland, but they just want to be citizens of the country and live their lives. So she ends kind of talking about what they think their future is going to be like. Not even necessarily from the perspective of just the Tamils, but kind of the perspective of the future of the country and will their neighbors get along and all that stuff. I want to say something more about Tenet. I really feel like I didn't give him just things. Well, Tenet, he was, let's see, an Irish sea captain. He was actually court-martialed. You know, often is the case that people that have these eccentricities that lead to further understanding or advancement in society, often in their time period aren't seen as forces of good. They're seen as forces of, if not rebellion, some sort of deviance or unnecessary, exploration, if you will. And so this tenant, I think after 7 or 8 years, was kicked back to England, and that's kind of how she ends the book, kind of talking about his obscure but very valiant story, as well as kind of the closing of her own personal story on the island. So anyway, I'm sure I did not do this book justice at all. I consider this on par with Not Quite Paradise, another book that I read that had a very similar and very high quality feel to it. These are both high quality books. Yeah, so if you're interested in kind of a country that is both, well, to steal from the other book, both paradise and, filled with strife, where people are happy and miserable, where people might not make a lot of money, at least the majority of people, but there tends to be a fairly high level of, happiness. Yeah, if you're just interested in Sri Lanka as a whole, this is a really good book that gets insight into the history, both the colonial era as well as, like their own personal history of Sri Lanka. It's a great book. Check it out. I read the second half of this book in one day because I got so engrossed, and I'm not a fast reader. I read the second half of this book in one day because I was so engrossed by what it provided. So, The Teardrop Island by The Teardrop Island, Following Victorian Footsteps Across Sri Lanka by Sherry Briggs. Check it out. It's a good book, you guys. All right. See ya. Bye.